Okie doke. All right, we'll get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. We have a really great presentation today by Dr. Al. I'm going to let him introduce himself in a second. I'm Andrew Becker, chair of the Gold Coast chapter for CAPPO. Our chapter is putting together some trainings, professional development trainings that we're going to be extending to the group. If you happen to not be a CAPPO member, I'm hoping this will encourage you to become one, because CAPPO really provides a lot of great guides and resources for the procurement community in California, and this is one of them. So we kind of opened this up as a kind of marketing event for CAPPO so that it could bring in more members and get more value to your organization. So this training was put on by our professional development committee in our chapter, and that is Grace, Curtis, and Maria on our call today. They have done a lot of great work putting together kind of a series going forward, so there'll be more of these as they come along. But with that, I'm going to give it to Dr. Al. Dr. Al, thank you so much for your generosity presenting for us today.
Absolutely a privilege to be with you. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you to the entire organization for allowing me to share some of these most recent insights. And I can get started. Everyone has a good view of the slides. And as we go along, if you have questions, feel free to come off mute and fire away. I'll be happy to try to respond to those, or you can save them to the end, whichever you prefer. So as Andrew indicated, my name is Al Iacobelli, Dr. Al Iacobelli. It just Al's great, not that formal. I am a retired executive who worked in the automotive industry for quite a few years in a senior executive capacity. I also worked for two of the large automakers here in Detroit. And as part of my professional development, didn't get a lot of ethics training. And later in my career, unfortunately, I was subject to a federal indictment. That federal indictment was a life-changing event for me because I didn't really see it coming. And that I don't say that lightly. And I really was quite set back at that point in time in my life, thinking, how could this have happened to someone who at one point in time had what was otherwise characterized as an unwavering moral compass by my peers, through my appraisals, and through my friends, families, and relatives. And so what I learned was, as despite all the education that I was exposed to, that I really needed to go back into the academic world and explore why this happened. And understanding what happens is quite easy when we experience things in our lives. The how, sometimes you need some forensic math in order to figure out how it happened. But the why really required an intellectual discussion that I couldn't have by myself. I really needed to get back out there, and I fervently pursued my doctorate degree, and continuing education has always been a deep philosophy of mine. So today what I'm sharing with you is not only some of the experience, but what are the things that can help you both from a practical perspective and from a research perspective as you continue your professional careers in what I consider to be one of the most important aspects of not only government, but in organizations, the procurement function. So with that in mind, I'll take you back a little bit in time to try to introduce this concept as easily as I can. Ethics, as we know it today, has been largely driven through the work of Aristotle. There's a book that he wrote, and he named it after his son, Nicomachean Ethics, and it dates back quite a few years, back to before the Common Era, 350 BC. And it was in this treatise that it was the first time we actually saw or really where ethics was distinguished as a distinct discipline. Now, keep in mind, Aristotle was a student of the Plato Academy, and Plato was a student of Socrates, but they had a little different twist on what they believed ethics encompassed. What Aristotle really introduced is something that we see today still in research and applies today, and even some of the neuro research that I'll show you. And it talks about how our learned experiences really help shape our virtues. And he refers to this as non-deliberate habituation.
Dr. Al, I think you muted yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sure what
No
that
problem.
happened. That non-deliberate habituation is really something that he talks about quite a bit, and something that we'll still talk about today. And the this notion of the virtue of character, ethos, how it's developed. And one of the things that he introduces that it was very controversial at the time was that your disposition wasn't the driving factor necessarily in how you behave in the work environment. That you're often faced with unwelcome choices, and you're going to make decisions that are not entirely voluntary. So how can that possibly happen, right? And that's the extent of it. It really carrying it forward, it really helps us understand why ethics is so critical in your environment. Why does it matter so much in procurement? Keeping in mind some of that work, it essentially establishes the link between the public and government. It is the public trust link, what you do. And it is also viewed as a line of defense against ethical compromise, your profession. Your ethical behavior has to ensure transparency, fairness, and accountability. But effectively, every transaction that you are part of is a reflection of the values of the state of California. That's a pretty daunting responsibility that each of you have. And I remember having similar type responsibilities in my response as a leader within the organization. Let's go to the, sorry. Um, if those elements were, when we talk about ethics, some of the issues that we're confronting today is in the form of a problem of practice. In research, we're often required to define what that problem of practice is. If our insulators and our bumpers are still working in the ethics world, why do we still have these incidents emerging? And one of the problems of practice in the procurement world and within the government is linked to some activity that the U.S. Department of Justice has now started to pursue with a great deal more interest. The U.S. Department of Defense, for example, recently there was an IT bid rigging scheme that was exposed, and unfortunately is resulting in some fines and likely some indictments. In New Mexico, we have a school district with violating the procurement and ethics laws by individuals. In Missouri, we have a state agency where officials illegally steered contracts, circumventing competitive bidding laws. And in New Jersey, we had a state comptroller found conflicts of interest with local government health insurance funds. So there's not a shortage of unethical activity that's occurring here. The U.S. Department of Justice has taken this a step further by developing what's referred to as the Procurement Collusion Strike Force, the PCSF, part of the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, and the Antitrust Division. So they've expanded this enforcement significantly with over 46,000 FBI agents and procurement officials. There are currently 195 open investigations. There have been 75 guilty pleas with trial convictions, some with trial convictions, and over $70 million in fines. This was as of the end of September. This is easily accessible on the Department of Justice website. So it tells you that the enforcement activity is amping up. We're still seeing unethical activity out in the field. So what's happening here? How do we mitigate this? How do we mitigate the risk to you individually as a professional in the procurement field and to the organization because of the implications to the broader public in the state of California? This is perhaps one of the most important facets that drew me to research. And I take it from a research perspective first so that we can understand how that's matured and how we can understand it better, how we understand our own behavior, essentially. So we're going to do a little bit of self-diagnosis today without having to share it among others. Um, Way back, I'd say prior to the 1950s, individual disposition and trait theory was a central theme to most of the research that we find. In other words, you were just born that way. Al, you were indicted because you're just a bad apple. You're just a bad guy, and you can't help it. Much of that was drawn from Darwin's original writings, The Descent of Man, but we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated in understanding how that's changed. And just before the 60s, we started to understand that human behavior is certainly a lot more complex and that we can expose our research field to both person, context, and behavior a little bit more to understand what stimulates unethical behavior. Why do we do what we do? Why are we prone to that behavior in some instances, and in some instances we're not? Clearly, the incidents are still occurring. Something's happening. Then in the 1960s, and we'll talk about two of these experiments, a couple of groundbreaking experiments occurred, one on obedience and one on situational and systemic forces that influence how we behave. We'll talk a little bit about that briefly and get your thoughts on it. Then in the early 80s, 90s, we start hearing more about organizational climate or organizational cultures. And then more recently, I had the privilege of participating in a number of publications that links leadership behavior to how subordinates behave, not only emulating behavior, but believe it or not, unethical leadership behavior can actually generate novel unethical behavior, or what we refer to as subordinate generative behavior. And we'll talk briefly about that. So from an organizational perspective, however, I always like to say that at least from my seat back in when I was working in the private sector, is that we always had published policies and we had guidelines and we had good guidance and we had great attorneys and we had great HR professionals trying to keep us on track. But those guidelines, what was published and what was actually going on, were oftentimes very different. And that's referred to as ethical decoupling. So how do you know if your organization is experiencing ethical decoupling? There's a few questions you can ask yourself, and I would ask you to respond to these. These are things that you can reflect on your own at this moment. Have you ever been in a situation where you're pressured to get it done, even if the rules must be bent? Have you ever been prompted to get creative to make it happen? Are these unethical practices, do they go unreported at all? Is it part of the organizational cultural norms? Are there times when you might feel uncomfortable about what you're being asked to do? These are prompts that I would ask that you keep in mind because these are important reflection points about what's going on within your own organizational culture. Ethical decoupling is a lot more common than we care to admit as organizational leaders, unfortunately, because we work incredibly hard to establish these principles and policies, and then lo and behold, these unethical behaviors creep into the organization, some motivated by profit, some by greed, some by selfishness, and sometimes we're not always able to identify when it's coming into the organization. So I'd ask you this question. In this particular scenario, a manager insists that a vendor be selected quickly, bypassing review steps to meet a deadline. Now, I'd ask you to come off mute here for a moment and give me your thoughts. What do you think the ethical and leadership issues that are at play here? Anybody take a stab at this? No volunteers?
I'll go ahead and take a shot at it.
Yeah, please.
Bas- Basically, what you have is a department that is showing favor to a vendor that they probably want to put into place. Unless there's a dedicated emergency, which it doesn't sound like there is one, they should follow the processes in accordance with the protocol. And it sounds like that is being strongly suggested that they don't.
Right, exactly.
You could have favoritism. There could be other reasons and factors, as you know, why they don't want to follow that. It's been my experience that anytime somebody is involved in the process, most of the time, like when you run an RFP, it's got a protocol. You go through it, and at the end, you go ahead and make your evaluations, you award it, and you move forward. In this particular instance, anytime somebody wants to hurry something through, there's usually, either they sat on it and they got way
Mhm.
behind, or number two, there's something unethical that's, brewing.
Right, precisely. Thank you for sharing that insight. You've hit the nail on the head. The tentacles the implications to leadership behavior here are enormous. And particularly if one's being directed to do this and without a clear line of sight of what the motivating factor is. And it has huge implications on the ethical cultural norms within the organization. All it takes is one instance. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, who we'll talk about here in a moment, once said that all evil begins at 75 volts. And he's referring to Stanley Milgram's experiment that we'll show you a little bit about. It doesn't take a lot to start that ball rolling. We need just one incident to start it. And it can result in greater incidents, as you'll soon see. Back in 1961, there was a groundbreaking experience that some of you might remember or even heard of, or maybe you saw or read about it in perhaps one of your classes in school. And it was Dr. Stanley Milgram out of Yale University. He conducted what was then called the obedience experiment, an obedience to authority experiment, where participants were instructed to administer electric shocks to learners. The learners were Confederates, individuals that the participants did not know were actually participating in the experiment. Participants did not know these learners were part of the experiment, so they thought they were just like them right off the street, just like you and I would be if we were to volunteer for an experiment. The electric shocks were fake. They weren't real, but they were gradually increased every time the learner failed to answer a question correctly. This experiment, needless to say, was extraordinarily controversial, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And I'm going to try to play this video here. The shocking results of this experiment, no pun intended, was that over 65% of the participants fully obeyed the instruction from an individual in a white lab coat and administered over 450 volts of electricity to these Confederate learners when they failed to answer a question properly. It shocked America when this happened because how could we possibly be that evil? Well, maybe we're not. Maybe it was the situation or the circumstance that helped influence this. So I'll save that second question for you in a moment, and hopefully you can have your speakers turned up. I'm going to try to play this.
There's no audio.
I can hear it.
Now, with that being said, perhaps this was just a one-off experiment, some believed, but this actual experiment has been replicated under the authority of the Institutional Review Board as late as 2020 with similar results. So I would ask you, what percentage of the participants do you think fully obeyed instruction and administered 300 volts of electricity to those Confederate learners? About 150 volts less than the actual fatal dose. Anybody want to take a guess? 100%. Thank you, Deanna. That is precisely correct. 100% of the participants administered at least 300 volts of electricity when they failed to answer the question properly. This was highly controversial, and the experiment itself was viewed as unethical because of the effect it had on individuals. But the results, however, remain stable even today, even though it's been replicated so many times. About 10 years later, you may recall Dr. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. I had the privilege of communicating with Dr. Zimbardo. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. Was a brilliant man, but he too engaged in an experiment that was highly controversial. I believe Netflix has a special on the experiment itself, where he takes student volunteers and converted part of the population to be prison guards and some to be prisoners. This experiment really introduced the power of the situation and systemic forces on these guards, who were basically transformed into being very abusive individuals toward the volunteer prisoners. He refers to this as de-individuation, that the culture around you can have a significant effect on how you behave, and belonging within an organizational norm structure, or it's referred to as organizational climate. He also highlights the power of roles, rules, and symbols and group identity in validating that unethical behavior. Now, these two experiments were, as I indicated, were highly unconventional and unethical, and in fact helped contribute to the 1974 Belmont Report, which essentially was the blueprint for the Institutional Review Board process today. If we were to conduct an experiment of this nature, it would never pass. But the 2020 experiment, I believe, limited the the presumed voltage to 150, and that was administered with the same type of results. They remain groundbreaking, these revelations, because it really exposes the frailty of our human condition when it comes to us committing harmful acts under certain circumstances, things that we would never imagine that we would otherwise do. Recently, I had the privilege of participating in a study that really exposed a dimension of unethical behavior that was quite interesting. That when we are exposed to a leader who's behaving unethically, we're not only capable of replicating that behavior, but we can extend that and create novel unethical behavior. Well, how can that be? How can we generate novel unethical behavior? If I see my boss behaving unethically for the good of the company or the good of my department, I should be able to do the same thing. But in reality, that's not how our brains function. Our brains function very differently. In fact, I'm more prone to behave unethically, self-serving, as well as pro-socially when I understand that my leaders are behaving unethically for the good of the organization. So what we were able to determine through now a second study with the assistance of my fellow researchers, Dr. Melody Cho from University of Hong Kong Science and Technology, John Jameson, and Dr. Courtney Porter from Marymount University, was that we are in fact capable of creating novel unethical behavior that extends beyond the observed leadership behaviors. This is an important facet to remember when we talk about mitigating strategies. What happens in our minds, we have this beautiful little almond-shaped collection of neurons located in the temporal lobe of our brains called the amygdala. We have two of these beautiful little almond-shaped items in each hemisphere of the brain. They're part of our limbic system, and they help us process emotional stimuli. This is part of the brain that automatically detects danger and plays a significant role in behavior, emotion, control, and learning, and how we learn. A large body of our research demonstrates that in this particular study back in 2016, brings back a familiar word that we talked about a few moments ago, habituation, that Aristotle coined. A large body of the research demonstrates that our response to an emotional evoking stimulus actually weakens with repeated exposure. In other words, the more frequently we're exposed to an unethical or disturbing environment, video, photograph, culture, our response to that weakens. Our amygdala activation in response, our brain, response to that negative image decreases with time. We become conditioned. They measured this through what's called a functional MRI, very similar to what you would have for an MRI, except that it's a functional MRI linking sensors to the brain. Signals that help curb dishonesty actually diminished. And with repeated exposure, there was a remarkable observation that individuals were more prone to self-serving dishonesty. So if I'm exposed, in plain English, to an unethical leader or an unethical condition that might be linked to behaving unethically for the good of the company, for the good of my department, there is a high probability that over repeated exposure, that the novel unethical behavior can broaden to self-serving dishonesty. What this essentially means is that small deviations in the moral code can easily escalate to large deviations with repeated exposure. I think we refer to this as the slippery slope. So, ethics in the human condition is a very fragile relationship. I learned this firsthand, the hard way. We are in fact vulnerable to adjusting our behavioral intentions based on what others think and what other peer groups think, even when we know better. One study in particular demonstrates that even when we know better, if we're exposed to a peer group who attempts to suggest otherwise, we may believe what they're saying. We have also a tendency to conform to social roles that we're expected to play, especially in structured environments. If you haven't had the time or have never done so, I would strongly encourage you to look at Philip Zimbardo's YouTube videos. He does some remarkable TED Talks that speak specifically to this particular condition. The structured environment has a remarkable effect on how we think. What begins as a small deviation in moral code escalates quickly. All evil begins at 75 volts, as Zimbardo would say, relative to the Milgram experiment. As we adapt to dishonesty, the line between good and evil becomes very permeable. That's a very discomforting thought, but it's the truth. The fact is that despite the hardwiring moral code in our minds that says don't do it because it's unethical or wrong, when you're exposed to repeatedly to a condition, your response mechanism weakens. Social and organizational cultural factors also have an effect here. So the big takeaway here is that there's a significant gap between what we say we will do in a situation. However, under pressure, we can behave radically differently. Also, there's a condition that's called diffusion. This diffusion often occurs in group settings where you might diffuse responsibility or rationalize the unethical behavior because everyone else is doing it, or we were doing it collectively, right? This is a very common situation that occurs. So let's talk about preventative forces here. And rather than getting into abstract moral theory, I'd like to get down to some real practical things that we can control and institute for ourselves and for the good of the organization when it comes to potential leakage in ethical behavior. It begins first and foremost with leadership. Ethical leaders have a remarkable effect on the culture. They set the tone for the culture, the climate, how we behave, how we interact, okay? And that fosters either dialogue or closure. It either encourages staff to challenge and question unethical requests, or it closes down communication and potentially magnifies unethical behavior. This transparency and accountability is critical to managing moral disengagement. Moral disengagement is an incredibly difficult and complex element to measure in research, as I learned firsthand. But notwithstanding that, there's a great deal of work that suggests there's not a clear path to moral disengagement when it comes to leaders and how we respond. Our mind is a very complex instrument, and we behave very differently under certain circumstances. But one thing is absolutely universally understood, that the ethics of the leader has a tremendous effect on the culture and therefore how we behave within that culture. What you can do individually is, I think, first and foremost paramount to keeping yourself well, healthy in this environment. Recent groundbreaking research has demonstrated that you are much more likely to behave ethically if you have a high identity integrative factor. And what does that mean? I often start with a group, when I'm in person with a group, I like to start by asking, well, how many of you are the same person at work than you are at home? Are you the same person? Or do you put on a different personality the minute you walk into the office setting? That's an important question to reflect on today. And perhaps I would ask you to think about that frequently. The more consistent you are between your authentic you at home, at work, the less likely you're engaging in unethical behavior. Well, how can that be? This seamless transition, so to speak, really is a testament to your security of your identity. The more true you are to yourself at home, and if you carry that self at work, you're much less inclined to engage in unethical behavior. However, if you find yourself putting on a different personality at work, I'm not suggesting that's bad, but you are opening up a door, at least through the research that we have disclosed, to the potential of making yourself even more vulnerable to unethical behavior. Well, you have to ask the question, why? Why does that happen? Because the cultural norms might help shape how I behave at work, and it might not be congruent with how I'm behaving at home. So this is one item that you can control, and you can control it by self-reflection. The moral compass that we all have in our mind and in our hearts really begins with reflection and the decisions we can make to remain ethical or unethical. I always tell people when I speak to groups, the indictment for me was possibly the best thing that could have happened to me. Well, how could you say that? It was a tragedy. My family suffered. Financially, we suffered. It actually saved my life and brought me back to where I was before I entered the industry. The moral compass requires nurturing, time, care, something I wasn't very good at, but something you can be very good at and something you must be very good at in the procurement field, particularly for the state of California. Beware of normalization. When you start to see unethical behavior become accepted within the organization, this is when you have to take a step back and begin that reflection as a part of the normal exercise. One of the keys to success here is aligning yourself with ethical leaders, having informal dialogue with them, going out to lunch or whatever social event you might have. Align yourself with them. Use self-reflection to identify when there's a separation occurring so that you can respond more appropriately. And connect your values to the actions. Now, there's a litany of abstract theory that I could talk about for hours, but I preferred to focus on two elements: the moral compass and recognizing your identity is an important facet to maintaining ethicality both at home and at work. What your organization can do is also very important. I noticed, I talked to a lot of organizations, they're spending an enormous amount of capital on what's referred to as enterprise risk management or integrated risk management. Integrated risk management are systems that link to your HR systems, your procurement systems, manufacturing systems, and identifies where there might be something going on that's unethical, nefarious, or inconsistent. Okay, those are all very good things to have, but they're really addressing the symptoms of unethical behavior. What I would suggest is that organizations begin evaluating, and I do this quite frequently, is understand the ethical risk profile of your workforce first. Understand where that risk is. There are anonymous survey tools and reports that provide strategic insights into the targeted ethics training that your organization might need, specific to the culture that you have at a particular location. That's very different than dealing with the symptom after the fact and perhaps public disclosure that could be embarrassing both to the state, to yourself personally, and to your community where you're located. Therefore, when you have that body of knowledge of the risk variables, are my people more prone to pro self unethical behavior? Are they more prone to unethical behavior for the good of the company? It helps us develop a targeted ethics training, face to face, not check the box online, but a face to face, meaningful encounter where your organization can invest in that ethics and compliance training. Another thing the organization can do is put out clear protocols for development plans. development plans are a foundation to our compensation system and our development as leaders. When we can link ethics to development plans, there's a win-win scenario for both the organization and the individual. And lastly, which I'm pretty sure that the state already has, is an anonymous reporting channel. These are incredibly effective at exposing where there might be concerns relative to ethics. I kept this at approximately 41 minutes. I could go on and on. I can take any questions right now if you'd like. I'm putting up my contact information here. Please feel free to write me a note if you have any questions or concerns, or if there is further interest in any type of ethical risk profiles at your specific location. I'm happy to provide further insight on that. So with that, that concludes this presentation. I hope you found it interesting, brief, and meaningful, and I wish that all of you have wonderful, successful careers. And if at any point in time you ever have a question or a concern, please feel free to reach out. Be happy to respond.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Al. Again, this was really an enlightening presentation. Your story is so compelling, and I appreciate the time. Do we have any questions from anyone who would like to ask while we're still on the call? Okay. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you, Professional Development Committee of Gold Coast, for setting this up. Thank you, Maria, for the introduction to Dr. Al. It's been a pleasure, and we appreciate so much of your time and effort that you've given us today. So
Yeah,
thank you
my
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you, Andrew. And one of the questions I saw, can you have a copy of the presentation? I'll send it over to Maria. Feel free to distribute it as you wish.
Perfect.
Actually, you know what? I do have one question for Dr. Al, and thank you so
Okay.
much for taking the time
Yeah.
presenting ethics and unethical behavior to this group of professionals. I know that it is a challenge for some of us to be able to sometimes act ethically based on our environment, but there are times when you do have to stand your own ground and refuse certain directives based on your moral compass or your belief system, whatever that may be.
Mhm.
How are you able to navigate and there are repercussions when it comes to those things. How are you able to navigate that challenge where you're doing something that you believe is right, not just for the organization, but also for yourself, and having to face backlash in the organization where it impacts you professionally in terms of growth or moving towards maybe another organization. There seems to be an impact in our
Yeah, no.
reputation.
Yeah, I wasn't popular when I made ethical decisions at times in my organization either. And there are two facets that I would say you want to link to. First and foremost, engaging leaders that you know are ethical that can support you in that decision that you might be making. Secondly, referring back to one of the slides, having confidence in your true identity to ensure that you're not modulating or to what your expected behavior is, and that is who you are. You are an ethical person. You're working in an environment, the foundation of which is public trust. So you have an obligation there. And lastly, I would say something that I didn't do a good job of personally was if I didn't behave ethically and didn't make the right decision, what were the consequences realistically? The U.S. Department of Justice has opened over 195 procurement cases. Okay. Oftentimes, I had no idea that I was under investigation. But I can tell you this much, looking, hindsight is always 2020. Had I known I was going to go through what I went through, it would have been much easier to stand my ground at the time when I was being challenged. Because one thing you completely lose once an incident occurs, you completely lose control of the narrative. And that's something that can be quite damaging to you personally and your family, as well as the organization. So I would say weigh those factors when you're making decision. It will give you remarkable strength in doing the right thing,
Yeah.
and then engaging the leaders that you believe can help support that decision.
Thank you. That's very insightful.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Pardon me.
That's it. Any other questions? Andrew, thank you again. Maria, your entire Gold Coast team, and of course the broader organization. It's been a privilege to be with you today. But at any point in time in the future I can be of any service, feel free to reach out. And wishing you all the very best. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Al.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Al.
everyone, for coming.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Have a good day.